right. So we've got this massive stack of articles you sent me about the Ukraine-Russia conflict.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
tons of different international publications here. And
Yeah.
a lot of it seems to be focusing on this possible ceasefire.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the thing that really jumps out is that there's this proposal for a 30-day ceasefire that's kind of floating around. And, the U.S. and Ukraine seem at least cautiously optimistic. But Russia's response has been a lot of,
Yeah.
well, yes, but.
Yeah, like President Trump called Putin's initial response promising but incomplete, and even sent Steve Witkoff, his Middle East envoy, over to Moscow to talk directly to Putin.
Yeah.
But from what I'm reading, Russia's already kind of laying down some pretty big conditions.
It's almost like they're saying, yeah, we'll agree to it in principle, but then immediately they're like, well, hold on. There are all these things that we need. And Putin's advisors keep saying they want a long-term settlement that addresses the root causes of the conflict.
Okay.
And they're basically saying this ceasefire is just a temporary breather.
So what does that tell us? Is Putin just playing for time here?
That's certainly a possibility. I mean, if you look at Russia's recent military gains, particularly how they took back control of the Kursk region, it's clear that, they're in a pretty strong position right now.
Yeah, and that makes me think about Putin's whole visit to those troops in Kursk while he was in full military fatigues.
Right.
That's got to be a calculated move, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's a very deliberate message, both for his domestic audience, but also for the rest of the world. And what makes it even more interesting is the timing, because that visit happened right before the news of the ceasefire proposal came out.
Okay, so you're thinking he's trying to leverage those military victories in the negotiation.
Exactly. Yeah, he's basically saying, okay, Russia is willing to talk, but we're negotiating from a position of strength, and then by constantly bringing up these root causes, which for Russia means things like preventing Ukraine from joining NATO and maybe even giving up some territory. He's setting a very high bar right from the start.
Yeah, it seems like from what I'm reading, Ukraine is at least open to the idea of a ceasefire, but they don't want to accept any kind of frozen conflict situation or anything that would compromise their sovereignty.
Yeah, and they keep insisting on security guarantees, which puts them in a really tough spot.
Yeah.
I mean, they really need a break from the fighting, but they're also worried about any agreement that would, just solidify Russia's gains and leave them vulnerable.
And then you've got Trump, who seems really focused on ending this war quickly.
Right.
And getting back to normal relations with Russia, which makes you wonder if he'll end up pushing Ukraine into accepting terms that aren't really in their best interest just to get a deal done.
That's a real concern, yeah. And it kind of highlights one of the risks here, because Putin is very good at exploiting those kinds of divisions and weaknesses.
Yeah.
I mean, he could easily use Trump's desire for a quick deal to drive a wedge between the U.S. and its allies.
So it sounds like we've got a lot of competing motivations here in a very delicate balancing act.
Definitely. And remember, we're just looking at the initial reactions here.
Right.
These negotiations are just getting started, and things could change very quickly in the next few days or weeks.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and talk about Putin's strategy here.
Okay.
I mean, he's obviously a very shrewd operator, and I have to imagine he's got a few different goals in mind.
That's a great point. And we can't forget that Putin's playing a multidimensional game here.
Yeah.
He's got his domestic audience to think about. He wants to maintain his image on the world stage. And of course, there are his actual strategic objectives in the conflict itself.
So what do you think he really wants? Is it about getting a decisive victory, weakening the West, or something else entirely?
That's the question everyone's been asking for years, and there are all sorts of theories out there. But one thing's for sure, Putin's a master at using ambiguity and calculated moves to keep everyone guessing.
All right, well, let's try to unpack some of those calculated moves, because I'm really struck by this idea that he's framing the ceasefire as a temporary breather, but at the same time, he's pushing for a long-term settlement that addresses those root causes.
Right.
Seems kind of contradictory.
Yeah, and that's actually what makes it so fascinating, because on the surface, it might seem like he's sending mixed messages, but if you look a little closer, you start to see how this could actually be a really clever tactic.
Okay, I'm all ears. Explain it to me.
Well, by putting forward these ideas that seem to conflict, he's basically forcing Ukraine and the West to pick between two bad choices. Either they agree to a short-term ceasefire that doesn't deal with the underlying problems and leaves them open to more aggression from Russia, or they get stuck in these long, drawn-out negotiations about those root causes, which could go on for months or even years, and that gives Russia even more time to consolidate their gains.
So it's like he's putting pressure on them,
Exactly.
forcing them to make concessions just to get to the negotiating table.
Right. And it also lets him present himself as the reasonable one.
Yeah.
The one who's actually committed to peace.
It's crazy how every word, every gesture, every public appearance is part of this bigger game he's playing.
And we haven't even talked about the role of disinformation and propaganda in all of this.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other level of complexity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because we're seeing all these conflicting stories coming from both sides, and it's hard to know what to believe.
It's textbook information warfare, and it's something we'll definitely need to dive into more as we go through these articles.
So just to recap, we've got this proposed ceasefire that a lot of people are skeptical about.
Yeah.
We've got a Russian leader who's keeping his cards very close to his chest and a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen next.
Plus, you can't forget about the wild card factor of Trump and his unpredictable way of dealing with foreign policy.
Right. It definitely adds another layer of complexity to an already pretty volatile situation.
Yeah.
This is a situation we've got to keep a close eye on. So before we move on to the next part of this this deep dive, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about the situation in Kursk. You said it was strategically important, but I'm not entirely clear on why.
Oh, right. Yeah. That's worth explaining a bit more. For Ukraine, holding on to Kursk was a way to put pressure on Russia, show that they were strong and maybe even use it as leverage in negotiations.
It was a pretty bold move,
Yeah.
Launching an incursion into Russian territory.
Yeah.
But from what I'm reading, it seems like they've lost control of it.
That's right. Yeah. Russia's been steadily taking back control, and now they're using it to their advantage.
So how does this factor into the ceasefire negotiations?
Well, it all comes down to leverage Russia's success in Kursk gives them a stronger position when they're at the negotiating table.
Okay.
They can point to that victory as proof that their military is superior and use it to get concessions from Ukraine.
It's a bargaining chip.
Exactly. And it shows something really important.
Mm-hmm.
Putin's not just interested in a ceasefire. He wants a win, and he's willing to use any means necessary to get it.
So for Ukraine, agreeing to a ceasefire could mean accepting a situation where they've lost territory and Russia's feeling even more emboldened.
Yeah, that's the tough reality they're facing. And it raises a big question. What are they willing to sacrifice for peace?
Wow. Those are some big questions to think about.
Yeah.
Before we get too deep into that,
Yeah.
I think we need to zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture here. Because this conflict isn't just about Ukraine and Russia. This has global implications.
Yeah, absolutely. The decisions that get made in these negotiations will have ripple effects that go way beyond the borders of these two countries.
So for the next part of our deep dives, let's take a wider view and explore what roles other global players are taking in this conflict.
Okay.
We'll look at how countries like China, India, and Brazil are navigating this whole geopolitical landscape.
Right.
And think about what their involvement means for how this whole thing might play out.
Yes.
Okay, so we've talked about how this situation in Ukraine, it's not just about those two countries.
Right.
It's got much bigger implications. It's like everyone's watching this whole thing play out, trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah, and some players are a lot more active than others. I mean, you mentioned China, India, Brazil. They're all kind of in a tough spot trying to balance their own interests with the pressure from both Russia and the West.
It's like they don't want to get caught in the middle, but they can't just ignore it either.
Exactly. Like take China, for example. They've got these close economic ties with Russia, right? But they also depend heavily on trade with the West. So they're not going to come right out and condemn Russia, but they're not exactly throwing them a lifeline either.
So what do they actually do? I'm really curious what these articles say about China's actions.
Well, there's been a lot of diplomacy going on behind the scenes. From what I'm seeing, China's been pushing for a peaceful resolution, through dialogue and negotiations. They've also been providing humanitarian aid to Ukraine, which is interesting.
It seems like they're trying to position themselves as a neutral mediator, maybe even trying to gain some diplomatic influence in the process.
Yeah, that's a good point. And it's not just China either. India's been playing a similar game, abstaining from those UN votes condemning Russia, and they're still buying Russian oil at a discount.
So they're kind of benefiting from the situation while also trying to stay on everyone's good side.
It's a tricky balancing act for sure, and it really shows you how complex the global geopolitical landscape is. These countries aren't just picking sides, they're making strategic decisions based on what's best for them.
It makes you wonder how much influence they actually have on the outcome, though. I mean, can they really sway Putin or Zelensky?
That's a tough one. While they might not be able to directly tell them what to do, their stance can definitely affect the overall situation. For example, China's continued economic support for Russia that could help to soften the impact of those Western sanctions.
And their calls for a peaceful solution that could offer a different perspective from those in the West who are pushing for a military response.
Exactly. So even though their influence might not be super obvious, it's definitely something to consider.
Okay, so we've got these big players on the sidelines, each with their own agenda. But what about the people actually in the middle of this conflict? What do these articles say about the pressure Putin and Zelensky are facing at home?
That's a really important aspect that often gets overlooked. The political realities in Russia and Ukraine, they play a huge role in the decisions their leaders make.
I can only imagine the pressure Zelensky's under to protect his country and his people.
Oh, absolutely. He's dealing with a war, a humanitarian crisis, and a population that's looking to him for leadership.
And from what I'm reading, he's not just fighting external threats. He's got internal divisions and people criticizing how he's handling things.
That's right. There are groups in Ukraine who think he should be tougher on Russia, refuse to negotiate, and just fight to the end.
It must be so hard to balance those competing pressures.
Yeah.
The need for peace, but also the need to protect his country's independence.
Yeah, it's a tightrope walk with incredibly high stakes.
And what about Putin? What's going on politically in Russia right now?
Well, on the surface, it might look like he's got everyone's support. But if you look a little closer, you can see some cracks.
Really? I'm surprised to hear that. What kind of cracks?
Well, those economic sanctions that the West imposed, they're starting to have an impact, and that's making some people in Russia unhappy.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Even if people support the war, they're not going to be thrilled if it's hurting their wallets.
Exactly. And there's also a growing number of Russians who are against the war entirely. They're facing a lot of repression from the government, but they're starting to make their voices heard both inside and outside of Russia.
So even though Putin might seem strong and in control, he's also got his own challenges to deal with.
Definitely. And those internal pressures are probably influencing how he's approaching these ceasefire negotiations.
Okay, so we've got this mix of international politics, internal pressure, and strategic maneuvering. It's enough to make your head spin.
It's a lot to take in, and we're just scratching the surface here.
Before we move on, I have to ask, what if this ceasefire doesn't happen? What if these negotiations fall apart? What are the consequences?
That's not a fun question to think about, but it's important to consider. If these talks fail, things could escalate pretty quickly.
And what would that look like? I'm trying to imagine the worst case scenario here.
Well, one possibility is that Russia launches a full-on offensive trying to take even more of Ukraine.
And that would probably lead to a lot more casualties and people being displaced. It would make the humanitarian crisis even worse.
Exactly. And it could even pull NATO into the conflict, which could trigger a much wider war in Europe.
That's a scary thought. And I've seen some articles talking about the possibility of nuclear weapons. Is that something we should be worried about?
It's definitely a concern that we can't just ignore. While a full-blown nuclear war is still unlikely, the risk of things getting out of hand or a miscalculation happening, it's always there, especially with tensions this high.
So the stakes are really high, not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for the whole world.
That's right.
And that's why it's so important to try to understand this conflict. We need to know the different perspectives, what's motivating the key players, and what could happen based on what they do.
It's a reminder that we're all connected, and that the decisions made by leaders in other parts of the world can have a big impact on our lives.
And it shows how important things like diplomacy and dialogue are, and trying to find peaceful solutions to these complicated global problems.
Okay, well, those are some pretty heavy things to think about as we head into the final part of this deep dive.
Yeah, but I think it's important to face these tough realities head on.
I agree. So for this last part, let's focus on the possibility of a diplomatic solution. We've talked about the challenges and the risks, but are there any reasons to be hopeful? Are there any ways forward that could lead to a lasting peace? Okay, so we've talked about a lot, the back and forth on the ceasefire, the global politics behind it all, but it's easy to get lost in the details. So what I really want to know is there a realistic chance for peace here? It's the big question, right? And to be honest, the answer is not that simple. I mean, these articles paint a pretty bleak picture. A lot of mistrust, conflicting goals, and political gamesmanship.
Yeah, and like we said, both Putin and Zelensky are dealing with pressure at home, which makes compromise even harder.
Exactly. But even with all that, there are a few little signs of hope, some possible ways for diplomacy to actually work.
Okay, I'm ready for some good news. Tell me more.
Well, first off, the fact that they're even talking is huge. Remember, a few months ago, direct negotiations seemed impossible. Now you've got Trump's envoy in Moscow, and even though we don't know exactly what they're saying, at least the door's open.
So you're saying the fact that they're talking at all is a good sign, even if we don't know the specifics?
Exactly. It shows that they're willing to at least explore a negotiated solution. And don't forget, this whole ceasefire idea came from talks in Saudi Arabia. That tells me there are people working behind the scenes, maybe countries like China or India, who are really pushing for peace.
And I bet those countries have a big reason to see this conflict end. I mean, the economic fallout's hitting everyone, not just Russia and Ukraine.
Right. Global trade's disrupted energy prices are through the roof. Food security is a concern. Nobody benefits from a long war.
So maybe that shared pain could actually push them towards diplomacy. It's like everyone suddenly wants peace.
It's a little cynical, but yeah, sometimes shared hardship can bring people together.
Okay, so we've got the open communication and the economic pressure pushing for diplomacy. What else should we be looking for? What are some signs that they're actually making progress?
Keep an ear out for a change in tone from both sides. If we start hearing less about root causes and demands and more about compromise, finding common ground, that's a good sign.
It's like they're switching from fighting words to the language of diplomacy.
Right. And another hopeful sign would be concrete actions like pulling back troops or exchanging prisoners. Things like that can build trust and get the ball rolling for more talks.
And maybe even a willingness to actually address some of those root causes in a more constructive way.
That's the key, isn't it? Dealing with those underlying issues is crucial for a lasting peace. It might mean tough compromises from both sides, but it's the only way to break this cycle of conflict.
It sounds like it'll be a long and difficult process.
No question about it. But, as we've seen time and time again, even the most stubborn conflicts can be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy.
Well, on that note of cautious optimism, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
It's been a fascinating discussion, as always, with more questions than answers.
But that's kind of the goal, right? To get people thinking, to challenge their own assumptions, and to encourage a deeper understanding of what's happening in the world.
Exactly. And even though we might not have all the answers, I think we've learned a lot about this conflict and the possible ways to achieve peace.
And to everyone listening out there, stay engaged, stay informed, and don't be afraid to question your own views. The world needs more critical thinkers, especially now.
Well said. And remember, even with all the chaos and uncertainty, there's always hope for a brighter future.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another look at the issues that matter most.